I'm Major Emily Cross, and for 11 years I let my own family believe I answered phones for the Department of Defense.
There is a version of this story where I walk into a country club ballroom in dress blues and watch federal agents put my father in handcuffs in front of 300 people who had spent their whole lives underestimating me. That version is coming. I promise you, that version is coming. But before I get there, I need you to understand the woman my stepmother shoved into a service corridor next to the trash compactors, wearing a $14 dress from a discount rack, holding a plate of appetizers she wasn't allowed to eat in the main room. Because that woman is also me. And if you only meet the one in the uniform, you won't understand what it costs to become her. If you've ever been the family member nobody bothered to ask a real question, tell me where you're watching from tonight. I read every single comment. And if this is the kind of story that gets you through a long week, hit subscribe now, because I have more of them and I'm not going anywhere. Here's where we start. Not at the party. Earlier. Because you cannot understand what happened under those fluorescent lights by the dumpsters unless you understand 34 years of being told gently and constantly that I was the disappointing draft of a daughter my father never got around to revising. My father is Arthur Miller. If you follow defense industry trade publications, which almost nobody watching this does, you might recognize the name from the masthead of Miller Dynamics, a mid-tier aerospace and avionics contractor headquartered outside Arlington. He built it from a single machine shop his own father left him into something that, on paper, looked like the American dream wearing a very expensive suit. My mother died when I was 6. I don't remember much of her except the smell of a specific kind of vanilla lotion and the sound of her humming off-key in the kitchen. My father remarried within 2 years, and the woman he chose was Victoria. Polished, exacting, the kind of beautiful that requires a full-time staff to maintain. Victoria did not raise me so much as she managed me, the way you manage a line item that keeps coming in over budget. 18 months after the wedding, Chloe was born. My half-sister. And I want to be fair here, because this isn't a story about a wicked child. Chloe didn't ask to be the daughter who arrived easy and golden into a house that had been holding its breath since my mother died. She smiled early, she slept through the night. She looked like Victoria, which mattered more in that house than anyone ever said out loud. And I was already there, 5 years old, quiet in the way children get when they've learned that being loud gets you compared to someone. The story about me got written early, the way these stories always are. I was difficult. I was intense. By 11, I'd already earned a small file of incidents in my father's mind. The desktop computer I took apart at 7 to see how the fan worked. The 2-week neighborhood operation I ran at 11 to map every storm drain after a flash flood nearly took a younger kid. Each time, the response was the same. Not curiosity about why I'd done it, just a tired question about why I couldn't be normal. Chloe got dance recitals and photo albums. I got a running commentary about how I made everything so complicated. My father was not a warm man, but he was not, in those years, a cruel one either. He was something worse in its own quiet way, absent while present. He'd sit at the head of the table reading contract summaries while Victoria narrated the day's events. And every so often, he'd look up at me the way you look up at a piece of furniture that's been moved slightly out of place. Noted, then ignored. There was exactly one place my father came alive around me, and it was his workshop, a converted garage behind the house where he kept old avionics boards and radio equipment from his early machinist days. When I was 9, he caught me in there taking apart an old radio transceiver, and instead of yelling, he sat down on the concrete floor next to me and for 40 minutes explained how radio waves worked. He handed me a small flathead screwdriver that day and told me to keep it, because a person who takes things apart should always have her own tool. It's one of maybe a dozen memories I have of him looking genuinely pleased with me. He never repeated it. I think some part of him was afraid of what it meant that his difficult daughter was also, possibly, his sharpest one. And being afraid of that, he simply stopped opening that door. I kept the screwdriver anyway. I still have it. By the time I was 17, the household roles had fully calcified. Victoria managed the optics of the family, the galas, the donor dinners, the version of the Miller name that appeared in the society pages. Chloe was the ornament, easy to love and easier to photograph. And I was the complication, tolerated at holidays, quietly steered away from anything that mattered. When I told them at 18 that I had accepted an ROTC scholarship and intended to commission into military intelligence, my father set down his fork and said, without looking up, "That's an interesting hobby to build a life around." Victoria said something about how the uniforms were at least practical, since I'd never been one for dressing myself properly anyway. Chloe, 12 at the time, asked if I'd get to shoot a gun, and when I said probably not, she looked disappointed on my behalf, like even she had expected more theater from me. I left for training 3 months later, and something happened that I have never fully been able to explain to anyone in that house. The thing my family called difficult, the pattern noticing, the refusal to accept the easy answer, the compulsion to take a system apart until I understood every piece of it, turned out to have a name in the place I'd gone. They called it analytical aptitude. Within 4 years, I was flagged for a strategic intelligence track. By 29, I was running fusion cells that synthesized signals intelligence, financial forensics, and human reporting into products read in rooms I'm still not allowed to fully describe to you.
By 31, I'd made major, serving as an operations coordinator attached directly to a joint task force under the Office of the Secretary of Defense, working economic security and counter-espionage cases tied to the defense industrial base. I did not tell my family any of this. Not the promotions, not the clearance level, not the fact that I had, by then, briefed people whose names occasionally appear on the news. The reason isn't a noble one. Telling them would have required them to be curious about me first, and I had stopped expecting that particular currency to show up. So when Victoria described my job to her book club as something administrative, very sweet, lots of paperwork, I let it stand. When my father introduced me at a fundraiser as working in an office at the Pentagon, filing things, I did not correct him. It was easier to let the story run than to hand people who had never asked a single real question about my life the satisfaction of a reveal they hadn't earned. There came a point, I can't tell you the exact date, only the season, a gray November about 18 months before the night I'm about to describe, when keeping the secret stopped being about pride and started being operational. That's the part I haven't told anyone outside a secure facility, and I'm going to tell you now, because it's the hinge the whole story turns on. My task force had been chasing a leak for the better part of 2 years. Not a dramatic leak, nothing that made headlines, which is exactly the kind that does the most damage over time. Small packets of proprietary avionics telemetry data, calibration tolerances, fault response algorithms, a handful of subsystem schematics, moving out of the American defense supply chain in pieces small enough that no single transfer tripped an alarm. It was death by 1,000 invisible cuts, funneled through a laundered chain of shell consulting firms and strategic advisory retainers, eventually landing with buyers our analysts believed sat well outside any country that should have had access to that data. We traced it upstream for months, layer by layer, shell company by shell company, the trail narrowing toward a single mid-tier subcontractor cluster in the Arlington-Chantilly corridor, companies exactly the size and shape to slip beneath the notice of the compliance apparatus built for giants. I remember the exact night the analytics team put the visualization up on the screen in our secure conference room, a spider's web of holding companies collapsing, one node at a time, toward a single parent entity. And I remember the physical drop in my stomach when I read the name at the center of the web. Meller Dynamics. My father's company. I did not say anything in that room. I sat there and looked at my own last name glowing on a screen in the center of an espionage network, and I did not flinch. Because flinching would have told 6 people in that room something about me I needed to control the release of. Myself. I disclosed the conflict to my chain of command the next morning, in writing. My supervisor read it twice before he looked up. "You're sure you want the analytical role," he said, "not a full recusal." "I'm sure," I told him. "I know that company better than anyone in this building. If you wall me off from evidence collection, you lose the one analyst who can tell you which behavioral cues actually mean something inside that family." He signed off, on the condition that everything I touched was logged and double-reviewed. It was. For 18 months, I went to Sunday dinners at my father's house and passed the potatoes to a man I had watched 2 days earlier in a classified brief, discussed as Subject 1. I sat across from Victoria at Chloe's engagement dinner, making small talk about caterers, while I already knew
because financial forensics do not lie the way people do, that a series of strategic advisory payments, totaling just under $400,000, had moved from an offshore account into Marcus Hayes' personal holdings over the preceding 14 months. Marcus is the reason the leak accelerated instead of staying at the manageable, survivable trickle it had been for years. He came into my family's orbit about 2 years before that night, dating my sister Chloe with the practiced charm of a man who has identified exactly which room he intends to eventually own. He worked, nominally, in business development for a firm that consulted for defense subcontractors, which, in retrospect, was less a coincidence than a hunting ground. I want to be fair to how it started, because I don't think Marcus set out at 26 to sell classified schematics to a foreign buyer. I think he set out to be comfortable, the way a lot of people do, and then discovered he was good at something that paid better than comfort, reading a mid-tier company's weak points and reading a family's weak points at the same time. Those two skills turned out to be the same skill. Once he saw how far the first strategic advisory arrangement could go without anyone in compliance blinking, the rest of it stopped feeling like a decision and started feeling like momentum. That doesn't excuse what he did. It just means the villain in this story wasn't born one. He was built, slowly, out of small permissions nobody ever pushed back on, which, if I'm honest, made him uncomfortably familiar to me. Marcus figured out something about my family faster than my family ever figured out about me, that the fastest way to be adored by Arthur Miller was to treat me as beneath notice. He calibrated it early, at a dinner where I'd made an offhand, technically precise comment about a supply chain vulnerability in an unrelated news story, and my father waved it off with, "Emily likes to sound smart about things she photocopies for a living." Marcus laughed at that, not cruelly at first, just the easy laugh of a man reading the room correctly. Once he saw how well the joke landed, he never stopped making it. "How's the filing going, Emily?" became his signature line at family gatherings, delivered with a wink, like we were in on something together. I'd say something non-committal and pass him the wine. It cost me nothing to let him have it, I told myself. It was a small tax on a piece I had otherwise stopped expecting from that house. There was one night, about 4 months before the engagement party, when I nearly lost the whole operation to a coincidence that had nothing to do with skill. I'd left a secure laptop bag in the hallway closet during a family dinner, and Victoria, looking for a serving platter, moved it and found a folder of printed bank routing summaries I hadn't fully redacted before I left the office. I remember the half-second of cold that went through me when she held it up. She looked at it for exactly 3 seconds, decided it was something dull and Pentagon-shaped, said, "Is this the filing you two keep joking about?" and put it back exactly where she found it. That's the moment I understood how well the joke was protecting me. Nobody was looking hard enough at the clerk to find the case she was building. That does not mean it didn't hurt, carrying both things in the same body for 18 months, the clerk joke and the closing net. Some nights, I genuinely could not tell you which one weighed more. The engagement party was scheduled for the third Saturday in September at the Ridgefield Country Club, the kind of place with a topiary garden and a membership waiting list longer than most people's mortgages. Victoria had been planning it for months, with the specific intensity she reserved for events where the Miller name needed to look its absolute best in front of people whose money mattered. It mattered more than usual that night, because the guest list included 3 men Victoria referred to, breathlessly, as the investors, a delegation flown in, ostensibly, to discuss a major new capital partnership for Miller Dynamics' expansion into next-generation avionics manufacturing. I knew who those men actually were 3 weeks before that party. The delegation's lead financier had surfaced in our investigative net 11 months earlier under a different name. Tied to a shell fund, our analysts had already connected to 2 of the offshore accounts feeding Marcus's personal holdings. He was not an investor. He was the buyer. And the capital partnership my father was so proud to be brokering that night was functionally the final handoff. 18 months of small transfers dressed up in black tie and hors d'oeuvres, timed deliberately around a celebration so that if anyone ever asked questions later, 300 witnesses would swear it had all looked like an ordinary party. I had briefed my task force on this exact possibility 4 days earlier. We had a plan.
It required me to walk into that ballroom looking like exactly the person my family believed I was. Harmless, peripheral, easy to overlook, for just a few more hours. I put on the same kind of forgettable dress I always wore to these things. I drove myself, because I always drove myself, because I had learned a long time ago not to be stranded in a room I might need to leave quickly. And in a slim clutch that did not match my shoes, alongside my lipstick and my car key, I carried a compact, encrypted satellite communication device the size of a deck of cards. It was standard issue for exactly one thing, and I had requested it specifically for that night, with the sign-off of people whose sign-off does not come easily. The party was, by every outward measure, a triumph. String quartet in the corner, champagne towers, Chloe in a gown that cost more than my last car, glowing in the unbothered way of a person who has never had to wonder whether the room was actually happy for her. Marcus worked the crowd like a man auditioning for the rest of his life, which, in a sense, he was.
I stayed near the edges, watching the room the way I'd watch a briefing screen. Who was talking to whom, who kept checking a phone, which of the investors hovered closest to my father, and which one hung back, watching everyone the way I was watching everyone.
The lead financier, the one our file called internally Subject Bravo, was standing near the terrace doors with my father and Marcus. At one point, my father gestured toward me, the way you gesture at furniture you're mildly proud of having in the house. I saw Subject Bravo's eyes track toward me, hold half a second longer than casual interest requires, and something in my training told me the timeline had just moved up. I started to cross the room, not urgently, just deliberately. Victoria intercepted me before I'd gone 10 feet.
She took my arm, not gently, and steered me, smiling so tightly it never once slipped for the benefit of anyone watching, toward the service corridor near the kitchen entrance, past the catering staff, past the industrial dish racks, to a narrow stretch of hallway that opened onto the loading area, where the trash compactors sat humming under a single flickering light.
"I need you to stay back here," she said. Her voice dropped to a register reserved for staff corrections. "Those men are serious people, Emily. Investment people. The last thing your father needs tonight is you wandering over there asking one of your strange little questions, making us look like we don't know how to keep our own house in order." I told her, evenly, that I just wanted to say hello.
"You can say hello to the room," she said. "From back here, if you have to say anything at all. Honestly, hold this." And she pushed a small plate of hors d'oeuvres into my hands, an actual plate, as though I were catering staff on a break. "And give people a few minutes before you go wandering around bothering the men who are actually going to matter to this family's future."
The men who were actually going to matter. Standing 12 feet from an industrial trash compactor, holding a plate of shrimp I hadn't asked for, in a $14 dress, while the actual foreign asset financing my father's downfall mingled freely in the next room, and my stepmother was worried I'd embarrass the family by existing too close to him. My father came around the corner a moment later, drawn by whatever brief flicker of disturbance Victoria's exit had caused. He looked at me, standing there with the plate in my hands, and something in his face settled into mild irritation. "What is this?" he said, gesturing vaguely at the plate, at the corridor, at me. "Victoria thought I'd be more comfortable back here," I said. He exhaled through his nose, the sound he'd been making at me since I was 7 years old. "Emily, tonight is not the night. I need those men to believe this family is exactly what it looks like on paper. Poised, serious. I cannot have you drifting over there cornering someone with one of your theories about supply chains." I said something then. I've turned it over so many times since that I can tell you it exactly. "You don't actually know anything about what I do for a living, do you?" It wasn't an accusation. It came out more like a genuine question. 11 years of accumulated exhaustion finally cracking the surface. Some part of me, even carrying everything I was carrying that night, still wanted him to surprise me. He didn't. He laughed, short, dismissive, and said the sentence I have never in my life heard 6 words do more work at once. "You're just a common clerk, General." He said general, the way you'd say it to a child playing dress-up with a stick for a sword, mockingly. He wasn't guessing at the truth. He was inventing a grandiosity to mock, precisely because the real thing had never once occurred to him as possible.
Somewhere behind him, the string quartet shifted into something bright and celebratory. Somewhere closer, through the kitchen swinging door, I could see Subject Bravo shaking Marcus's hand, the particular unhurried grip of two men closing a deal they believe no one else in the room understands the shape of. I looked at my father for a long moment. I did not raise my voice. Raising your voice is usually just a way of telling a room you've already lost the argument you're pretending to win.
Okay, I said. I set the plate down on a stainless steel prep table next to the trash compactor, and I opened my clutch.
The device I carried that night routed, via encrypted satellite uplink, to a small number of pre-authorized contacts. One of those contacts was Major General Marcus Sterling, no relation to the Marcus already in this story, and the coincidence of the name was not lost on me even in that moment. The two-star who commanded our joint task force, and the officer who, 11 months earlier, had personally signed off on the operational framework for what we'd codenamed Operation Perimeter, a coordinated action run jointly with federal law enforcement designed to freeze, seize, and dismantle the financial and logistical infrastructure the moment the final overseas handoff was confirmed in progress. I stepped into the shadow past the compactors and activated the device. He answered on the second ring. "Cross," he said. "No pleasantries." "Sir, Subject Bravo is on site and in physical contact with Subject 1 and Subject 2. Visual confirmation of a handshake consistent with transaction finalization behavior. Recommend authorization to execute perimeter now." A pause, not hesitation, just the weighted silence of a man running the calculus one final time before he commits real assets to real motion.
"Say the word, Major," he said, "and it's already moving."
I looked back through the small window in the swinging kitchen door, at the ballroom glowing gold and celebratory, at my sister laughing at something, at my father accepting a fresh drink, utterly certain that the story he'd built about the evening, and about me, was the only story in the room. "Execute," I said. "Copy. Perimeter is live. FBI and DOJ economic espionage units are already staged 2 blocks out. ETA 11 minutes. I closed the connection, slid the device back into my clutch, and stood there a moment, alone, next to a humming trash compactor in a corridor my own stepmother had decided was the appropriate place for me. I want to tell you I felt triumphant. Mostly, in that specific minute, I just felt tired. The particular tiredness of someone who has finally set down something they've been carrying so long, they forgot it had weight. Then I walked to my car. I keep a garment bag in my trunk, and have for the last 11 months, ever since the shape of that night's possible ending had become clear enough to plan for. Inside it, my service dress uniform, pressed, my rank insignia catching the parking lot's sodium light when I unzipped the bag in the back seat. I changed in the ladies' room off the club's side entrance, the one nobody important ever used, hands steady in a way that surprised me even as I watched them in the mirror do up the buttons I'd done up 100 times before in far higher stakes rooms than this one. In the bottom of my clutch, where the device had been, I felt the small flathead screwdriver I still carry, the one my father gave me on a garage floor 22 years ago. I don't know why I brought it that night. I think some part of me wanted the version of him who'd sat on that concrete floor to be there too, even if he didn't know it. I looked at myself for exactly 3 seconds before I walked back out. Major Emily Cross. Ribbons that meant things I have never once explained to my own family, because they never asked. Insignia my father had 90 minutes earlier mocked as an imagined delusion. I walked back into the club through the front entrance this time, not the service corridor. The first person to see me was a member of the club's front staff, a young man who had checked my coat 2 hours earlier without a second glance, and who now, seeing the uniform, straightened up so fast he nearly dropped the clipboard in his hands. I did not go looking for my family. The room found me instead, the way rooms do when something has shifted in the air before anyone can name what it is. Conversations thinned, heads turned. The string quartet kept playing for another full measure before someone noticed the room had gone strange around them and let the phrase trail off unfinished. Chloe saw me first, from across the room, and I watched her face through the thing faces do when a piece of furniture your whole life has quietly rearranged itself into a person. Victoria was next, her champagne flute frozen halfway to her mouth. And my father turned, mid-sentence, toward whatever had made the room go quiet,
and found me standing 18 feet away from him in dress uniform. And I watched 11 years of comfortable narrative try visibly and fail to reassemble itself fast enough to make sense of what he was looking at. I did not say anything to him. There wasn't time, because that's when the front doors opened again, and this time it wasn't a young man in a valet vest. It was a team of federal agents from the FBI's Economic Espionage Unit, moving with the specific, unhurried authority of people who know exactly how the next 10 minutes are going to go. A Department of Justice attorney a step behind them with a folder already prepared, and 2 uniformed liaison officers from our joint task force flanking the rear, there to confirm identities, not to lead. I want you to understand what that room sounded like in the half-second before anyone spoke. Nothing. 300 people who had spent the evening discussing quarterly returns and honeymoon destinations went completely, totally silent. The way a room does when it understands, before it can articulate why, that it is watching something it will still be talking about a decade from now. The lead agent went straight for my father. "Arthur Miller," he said, his voice carrying without needing to be raised. "And Marcus Hayes, I need you both to step away from the other guests." My father actually laughed, one short, disbelieving bark of a laugh, the sound of the man whose entire operating system has never once had to process an outcome it didn't design itself. "I'm sorry, what is this? Who let—" And then his eyes found me again, standing in uniform 18 feet away, and I watched something in his face finally catch up to the truth. Not all of it, not yet, but enough to understand that the ground under the evening had changed shape, and that somehow, impossibly, I was standing at the center of the change.
The DOJ attorney stepped forward with the folder. "Sir, you are being taken into custody on charges including economic espionage under Section 1831 of the Economic Espionage Act, conspiracy to defraud the United States in connection with defense procurement contracts, and violations under the Arms Export Control Act. Marcus Hayes, the same charges apply to you, along with additional counts related to the unauthorized transfer of controlled technical data to a foreign principal." Marcus went white in a way I have genuinely never seen a human face go white before, all the practiced charm draining out of it at once, leaving something much younger and much more frightened underneath. He looked instinctively toward the terrace doors, toward Subject Bravo, except Subject Bravo was no longer standing near the terrace doors. He was already in the custody of 2 more agents who had entered through the club's side entrance, precisely on schedule, precisely as Operation Perimeter's plan had specified he would be. "This is insane," my father said, and I could hear, underneath the outrage, the first thin note of real fear finally arriving. "This is a mistake. Emily." He said my name like it was the only fixed point left in a room that had stopped making sense. "Emily, tell them this is a mistake." I looked at my father, really looked at him, for maybe the first time in years, without the filter of a joke I was letting slide, and gave him the truest sentence I had. "It's not a mistake. I've been building the case against Miller Dynamics for 18 months. I read the transfer records myself. I watched the accounts. I know exactly what moved, when, and who authorized it." The color that left Marcus's face when the agents approached him was nothing compared to what left my father's when he understood fully and at once what I had just told him. Not that I worked for the Department of Defense, not even that I held rank, that I had known for a year and a half, across 100 family dinners, through every version of the Clerk joke, exactly what he had built, and exactly what it was going to cost him, and I had said nothing, because saying something too early would have let it keep growing in the dark. "You knew," he said, very quietly, and for the first time in my life, my father's voice had nothing performative left in it. "You knew, and you let me." "I let you keep making the choices you were already making," I said. "I didn't put a single dollar in those offshore accounts, Dad. I didn't sign a single advisory contract with a shell company routed through 3 jurisdictions. I didn't decide that a payment from a man I'd flagged 11 months ago was worth more than the country I've spent my entire adult life defending. You did that. All I did was pay attention, which is apparently the one thing nobody in this family ever thought I was capable of." The agents moved him then, hands secured, escorted past tables full of people who, 4 hours earlier, had been drinking his champagne and admiring his daughter's fiancé's ambition. Victoria stood frozen near the dessert table, one hand pressed flat against her chest, watching the entire architecture of her carefully curated life get let out through the front doors and restraints. Chloe was crying, not performatively, but the raw, wrecked crying of someone watching two structures collapse simultaneously: her father's freedom and her fiancé's future, in the same 60 seconds, under the same chandeliers. General Sterling arrived a few minutes later, once the room had been secured, in his own dress uniform, 2 stars catching the ballroom light. He hadn't led the raid. That wasn't his jurisdiction, and he'd have been the first to say so. But he'd come to see it through. And before he turned to leave, he did something I will carry with me for the rest of my career. He turned to the room and said, simply, gesturing toward me, "Major Cross has spent 18 months building the case that just walked 2 men out of this building. The country owes her a debt most of you will never fully understand, and I won't be able to explain most of it to you either, but I wanted this room to know exactly who did the work." Then he nodded to me, one clean, respectful nod, the kind exchanged between officers who have both been in rooms that mattered, and he walked out. I did not gloat. There was a version of that moment where I could have turned to Victoria and said something surgical about trash compactors and hors d'oeuvre plates. I thought about it, briefly, the way you glance at a cliff edge and register the drop without stepping toward it, and I let it go, because I'd spent 18 months being disciplined about far larger things than that. What I did instead was walk over to Chloe, still standing near the dessert table, shaking, mascara running in 2 dark lines down a face that had never had to hold an expression like that. I did not say I told you so, because I never had told her so. I had never told her anything, and some part of that silence was mine to own too. "I need you to hear one thing," I said, quietly, just for her. "None of what happened tonight is because of you. You didn't do this. But you're going to have decisions to make in the next few weeks about who you trust and what you build your life on top of. And I want you to make them clear-eyed, not the way this family has always taught you to make them, which is comfortable first and true never." She didn't say anything. She just nodded, still crying, and for the first time in longer than I could remember, my sister looked at me like I was a person and not a category. I left the club that night in my dress uniform, past a valet who could not stop staring, past a parking lot full of luxury cars belonging to guests who were going to spend the next several news cycles finding out exactly how much of the evening champagne had been funded by classified avionics data sold to a foreign buyer. I drove home with the windows down, the September air cold enough to make my eyes water, though it might not have been only the air. The collapse, once it started, moved faster than even I had modeled. Within 72 hours, federal investigators had frozen every account tied to Miller Dynamics' shell network. Within a week, the company's primary defense contracts, worth cumulatively well over $1 billion across their life cycle, had been suspended pending review, and 2 of its largest prime contractor partners severed ties publicly. Within a month, Miller Dynamics had filed for bankruptcy, its assets liquidated, its headquarters sold to a logistics firm that gutted my father's old office and turned it into a break room. My father's trial is ongoing as I record this. I'm not going to tell you the specifics, both because it's an active matter and because some of it isn't mine to narrate for entertainment. What I can tell you is that the plea negotiations, when they came from a man who had run out of every version of the story where he came out looking like anything other than exactly what he was. Marcus's case moved faster and landed harder because, unlike my father, who I still believe did not fully understand for years what he'd let grow in his own company, Marcus had known precisely what he was building from the very first strategic advisory conversation. He is looking, currently, at a sentencing range that will keep him out of my sister's life for the better part of 2 decades. Chloe did not marry him, obviously. She moved back in with a friend from college for a while, and then slowly into a small apartment of her own. The first thing, she told me later, that she had ever chosen entirely by herself, with money she earned entirely herself. Victoria's world, the one built almost entirely out of appearances, simply stopped existing. The club membership was quietly revoked. The society pages that once ran photographs of her galas ran instead a single unflattering paragraph about her husband's arrest. I don't know exactly where she lives now. Chloe mentioned once that she'd moved somewhere smaller, somewhere quieter, and that the calls between them are strange and stilted, in a way that suggests she still doesn't fully understand what happened, or her own part in it.
My father called me once, from a secure line his attorneys arranged, about 6 weeks after the party. I almost didn't take the call. He didn't apologize. Not exactly. Not the way people in movies apologize, with the neat, complete sentence that closes a wound in one motion. What he said instead, in a voice smaller than I had ever heard from him, was, "I used to watch you take that radio apart in the garage and think, she sees things the rest of us don't. And then I spent 30 years acting like that scared me more than it impressed me. I don't know why. I think I do know why. I just never had the nerve to say it out loud until a federal courtroom made me sit with it." I told him I appreciated him saying it. I did not tell him it fixed anything, because it didn't. And I've learned the hard way that pretending a sentence heals a decade is just another comfortable lie. I still fly to visit Chloe every few months. That relationship is the one genuinely repaired thing to come out of all of this, built brick by brick on actual questions she now asks and actually waits to hear the answers to. She asked me once what it had cost me, keeping the secret that long, sitting across from our father and Marcus at 100 dinners, knowing what I knew. I told her the truth, that it cost me something I'm still adding up, that there were nights I sat in my car in that driveway before family dinners, running through the cover story one more time, feeling like two entirely different women trying to fit into one body. That the Clerk joke, which everyone in that family thought was harmless, landed every single time on a woman who was quietly building the case that would end the man telling it. But I never once needed that room to salute me. What I needed, what some very old, very young part of me had been waiting on since a 9-year-old sat on a garage floor learning about radio waves from a father who never opened that door again, was for someone in that family to finally get curious enough to ask who I actually was. My sister asks now. In a family that once specialized in comfortable silence, that is close to everything. I still serve. Some mornings the work is quiet. Reports, analysis, the unglamorous architecture of keeping a country's secrets where they belong. Some mornings it isn't quiet at all. Either way, I go in. I do the next correct thing, and I come home to an apartment where nobody has ever once asked me to hold a plate of shrimp by a trash compactor so I wouldn't embarrass anyone. My rank was never going to be settled by whether my father understood it. It was settled a long time ago, in rooms he will never be cleared to enter, on nights nobody was there to applaud. What changed on that September evening wasn't my worth. It was, finally, the truth catching up to the people who'd spent 11 years too comfortable to go looking for it themselves. If you're the one your family calls difficult, the lurk, the punchline at the table, your worth was never theirs to grade. You do not owe anyone a reveal or a uniform in a doorway, or a general walking through the front entrance to prove what you are worth the entire time. It was already settled, a long time ago, in the work nobody saw. Thank you for staying with me to the end of this one. If this story hit you somewhere honest, hit like, subscribe, and drop a comment, because it genuinely helps stories like this reach the people who need them tonight. Have you ever been the difficult one in your own family, quietly carrying more than anyone around you gave you credit for? Tell me below. I read everyone, and I'm right here with you.